Here's an incredible lesson from the Frierdiker Rebbe about how to deal with the toughest things in life. Shaykhus Samaisu Gulubit Beis Gimmel Tammuz von Rebbe dem Shver, with regards to the Frierdiker Rebbe's release from imprisonment on the 12th and 13th of Tammuz, the Frierdiker Rebbe once commented, as in the Maimorim from the Rosh Hashanah Faran Meiser, within the Maimorim that he shared over Rosh Hashanah prior to his imprisonment, which is Rosh Hashanah Tafresh Beizayin, the end of 1926, one of the things he discussed was the Baal Shem Tov's unique approach to understanding divine providence, which is, as Hashgacha Pratis is that divine providence extends beyond humans to all life forms, even the inanimate, and every single detail within those life forms. So the Frierdiker Rebbe noted that it wasn't really a topic that was related to the theme of and the message of the Maimer. Says the Frierdiker Rebbe, und as Lulei Zois, weisen et sehr wohl gekannt durchtragen dem Meiser. Sevel sein die Yusurim and Arois von Meiser. So the Frierdiker Rebbe commented that if not for these Maimorim, he's not sure that he would have been able to go through to handle the challenges of and to emerge on the other side from his imprisonment under the Soviets. So we really need to understand what the Frierdiker Rebbe is telling us. Darf man verstehen? The Uftu von Shittas Baal Shem Tov in Hashgacha Pratis is kanal. The innovation that the Baal Shem Tov brings to the idea of divine providence is that even animals, plants, and inanimate objects are supervised by the Eibishter's direct, personalized providence. But the fact that there's Hashgacha Pratis for humans, that is not unique to the Baal Shem Tov. Everybody agrees. Even without the Baal Shem Tov's insight. And certainly everybody agrees that there is divine providence for the Jewish people, especially those who are dedicated to Torah mitzvahs. And how much more so when the Medubar is, if we're discussing people who are the leaders and the spiritual lights of the Jewish people, where whatever's going on in their personal life is directly relevant to the entire Jewish community, it goes without saying that everything in their lives is directed personally and specifically by the Eibishter. The question is, why did the Frierdiker Rebbe say that he needed to be conscious of the Baal Shem Tov's unique approach to Hashgacha Pratis to get him through the challenge of being in prison? Now, the Tmiya is not gresa. What makes this an even greater question is, here we're talking about the Frierdiker Rebbe being in prison, and why is it that specifically the consciousness of Hashgacha Pratis is what's going to help him? Das hat doch gehabt zu tun ganz mit Kiyum Torah Mitzvahs, mit Arbeitszeit Torah Wachsages Hayadus und mit Eis von der Schlichus von der Meibishter. Why is the Frierdiker Rebbe in prison? Because he was spreading Torah Mitzvahs and he was doing what the Eibishter wants. It's doch pshita, alles hashaychles. It goes without saying that whatever is engaged with his service of the Eibishter, kedel die Sachen, was haben sich getan mit den Rebben, seine Gewinn verbunden mit Ratzon v'Kavanas Hashgachas Hashem Yisborach. No doubt, whatever the Frierdiker Rebbe is doing is aligned with and totally on the same page as whatever the Eibishter wants. So why do we need to be reminded about Hashgacha Pratis? You're in a situation that is a direct result of doing what the Eibishter wants. So the Pashtas Yishlema, the easiest way to explain this might be as das Kufis, the Pshat von der Rebbe. That's actually what the Frierdiker Rebbe is saying. Durch Trogan, Lizba la Yisurim Velotzes min HaMeiser, the fact that the Frierdiker Rebbe could endure the suffering of the imprisonment and leave the prison. The Maimer that the Frierdiker Rebbe said was included within it explanation of the concept of Hashgacha Pratis. So maybe that helped the Frierdiker Rebbe, so to speak, be conscious of the fact that everything going on with regards to his imprisonment was Hashgacha Pratis from the Meibishter, directly from Hashem. And the Parot is like you can durchtragen, and that's what helped him to endure, because his expression is, I was able to endure it. Well, what helps a person to endure something really difficult? Knowing that this is directly from the Meibishter. Sabanit and ganz and glatik, but that's not really a good enough explanation. If that is the intention, that the Frierdiker Rebbe is going through something that to you and I looks extremely difficult, and he's able to endure it because he knows that it comes from the Eibishter, then the correct issue that should have been, so to speak, percolating would have been not so much that everything is by divine direction, but rather the concept that the Alter Rebbe speaks about in Tanya, that there's nothing negative or bad that comes from on high. So if you're going through something difficult, recognize it's from the Eibishter, and therefore it's all for the good. And the Alter Rebbe goes through details about how a person can shift their outlook to be able to endure difficulties and suffering. Not only to endure, but even to be willing, a willing recipient of those challenges, and to be besimcha. As the Gemara tells us, that in the same way that a person has to say a bracha over good things, you have to be able to say a bracha over the not so good things. As the Gemara says, that the goal is to accept whatever the Eibishter throws to our way, besimcha. So that would have made more sense if Friedrich Rebbe is talking about a very difficult time in his life and saying, I was able to take it with a positive outlook and with simcha. Why? Because it comes from the Eibishter. What's the emphasis specifically on Hashgacha Pratis and the Baal Shem Tov's approach to Hashgacha Pratis? So now we could say, look, it makes sense why the Friedrich Rebbe did not invoke the concept that no bad comes from on high in order to help him get through these challenges, because the Rebbe is called Kulei given Areingeton on Ibegegeben zu dem Eibischen und zu Torah Mitzvahs, because the Friedrich Rebbe was completely 110% dedicated to the Eibishter and to Torah Mitzvahs and whatever the Eibishter wants. He was so dedicated to the Eibishter that there was no consciousness of self, but made his move on. So it's not possible then that the Friedrich Rebbe could have a physical challenge that he'd find difficult to endure, because that's only relevant to a person who is very conscious of self and feels their suffering, but the Friedrich Rebbe doesn't have this. Because Friedrich Rebbe doesn't spend his time thinking about me, and am I okay, and am I suffering, and is this painful for me? So therefore he didn't need to be convinced that nothing negative comes from Shamayim, because he never felt that there was anything negative, because he wasn't feeling himself. So that explains why the Friedrich Rebbe did not have to invoke the principle that whatever the Eibishter does is for the good. But it does raise the question, if that is true, that the Friedrich Rebbe is so dedicated to the Eibishter's job that he doesn't feel self, then why is he even talking about the suffering of being in prison? Surely there's no suffering. Especially when you consider, why is the Friedrich Rebbe in prison? Not chas v'shalom for a crime, for spreading Torah, for strengthening Judaism, right across the whole communist regime. As we well know, because these are documented stories of what happened at the time. So you wouldn't expect the Friedrich Rebbe to be upset or hurt by being imprisoned. He should have been joyous for being imprisoned. He would have been joyous over the fact that because of his dedication to the Eibishter, he now has the opportunity to make a sacrifice for the Eibishter. To have literally the worst threat hanging over his head for day after day after day after day, that should have been a cause of a great simcha. And that is something we have precedent about. We find with Rabbi Akiva, when the Romans were going to murder Rabbi Akiva, and obviously that was Kiddush Hashem, he's sanctifying Hashem's name. So Rabbi Akiva, at the very same time that they were torturing him to death, he was in a state of the exact opposite of pain. He was in a state of tremendous pleasure. Because he said, my whole life I was worried, would I ever have the opportunity to serve the Eibishter, as we say in Shema b'chol nafshecha? Here's the opportunity. He was on top of the world. He had tremendous simcha. So surely the Friedrich Rebbe should have the same kind of experience. It doesn't make sense that on the one hand we're saying that the Friedrich Rebbe doesn't have to address that no bad comes from on high because he's not feeling self. He's completely selfless. And yet at the same time he's describing how difficult and painful it is to be in prison. How does that work? Shlomo den Birabozes, the explanation is, in seinem Maimorim, redet der Rebbe herum dem Chiluk zwischen dem Messias Nefesh von Rabbi Akiva und dem Messias Nefesh von Avraham Avinu. In other Maimorim, the Friedrich Rebbe describes the difference between the type of sacrifice Rabbi Akiva made versus the type of sacrifice Avraham Avinu made. Rabbi Akiva hat gesagt, Kol yom ha'yosi mitzta'er chulei, mosa yovi leyodi v'akaimenu. Rabbi Akiva spent his whole life worried and even feeling pain. When will I have the opportunity b'chol nafshecha to give everything away for the Eibishter? Hat gesucht und gestrebt zum Mesiras Nefesh mitzad atzma, which means he was constantly looking for and aspiring to Mesiras Nefesh in and of itself. Mitzad the grace teilkeit for Mesiras Nefesh, because Mesiras Nefesh is something so precious, he wanted to have that experience. Hier ist es durch dem kommt man zu der größten Weise von Verbundenheit und Vereinzelung mit dem Eibishter, because he understood and appreciated that when a person gives up their life for Hashem, that generates the ultimate level of union and connection to Hashem, and he wanted to have that experience. Avraham Avinu is completely different. Avraham Avinu hat nicht gesucht, Messias Nefesh, als Tachlit Torah für sich. Avraham Avinu never went around looking for the opportunity or when the time would come that he could sacrifice for the Eibishter. Zayin is given to Mefas and Zayin Lukus Ba'olam. Avraham Avinu was completely focused on his goal in life, which is to share the Eibishter with the world. Vayikra Shav Hashem Avaya Kel Oilam, as the pasuk says that he called everywhere by Hashem's name. Says the Gemara, Al Tikra Vayikra Ela Vayakri. Not simply that he called out in Hashem's name, but he got other people to call in Hashem's name as well. As given in ganzen reingetan in der Avodah to Mefarsim seine Lukus, Avraham Avinu was completely invested in his Avodah, which was to spread godliness everywhere. On Oib, es ist given verbunden mit Mesiras Nefesh. If along the way that would require sacrifice, das nicht mehr given klal hat sich Mesiras Nefesh given. That would not be an obstacle for him to fulfill his mission. So if you need Mesiras Nefesh, he'll have Mesiras Nefesh. He's not seeking Mesiras Nefesh, but if that's what the job requires, then he'd do it. On der Rebbe, Rabbi Akiva gehat einig von den Inuyah HaMesiras Nefesh. So that explains the psychology of Rabbi Akiva, who's being tortured in the most brutal fashion, and yet has pleasure from the experience because he knows that this is his objective in life, to have Mesiras Nefesh. Weil es hat sich gefüllt seine Vokash. He's reached his wish. To sacrifice himself for Hashem. Whereas by Avraham Avinu is aber given anders. Avraham Avinu's experience is completely different. When Avraham Avinu was locked in prison, it was a painful experience for him. Why? Because as long as he is imprisoned, he can't spread the Eibishter in the world. His whole purpose is not, I need to have Mesiras Nefesh, it's the Eibishter needs to get to the world. Right now, I can't do that. That's a painful experience. That is the attitude of the Frierdiker Rebbe. Zashlemus of Teves Atzmoi is the Matzav Anal Zukum zu Tachlis Zashlemus in Avodah for Mesiras Nefesh. If you're looking from his own, so to speak, development, then yes, to have Mesiras Nefesh and physically suffer, that would be a cause for tremendous simcha. I've reached that spiritual pinnacle. But that's not the Frierdiker Rebbe. Because the Frierdiker Rebbe was not looking to have the opportunity for Mesiras Nefesh as its own independent value. The only thing is that in order for him to fulfill his personal shlichus in this world, in order to spread Torah mitzvahs and chasidus, and if that requires Mesiras Nefesh, so be it. So the Frierdiker Rebbe is so dedicated to the job of spreading Torah and Chassidus and mitzvahs and strengthening Judaism that whatever needs to happen is going to happen. Even if there's a requirement of Mesiras Nefesh, zu jeder Zeit und auf jeden Tritt at that, whether it's at a particular time or at the various steps along the way of doing what he had to do. You see from the Frierdiker Rebbe that he never shied away from difficult or areas where he had to make sacrifice. Particularly under Stalin's rule before he was imprisoned. So, because the Frierdiker Rebbe is completely dedicated to the mission at all costs, even the cost of Mesiras Nefesh, then you can appreciate why he's in tremendous pain being locked in prison where he cannot do anything for the mission. Yes, it's true that the Frierdiker Rebbe had now been elevated, promoted to the level of somebody who sacrificed for Hashem. But that was still a painful, suffering experience for him. Because the fact is that all the difficulty and torture and being in prison prevented him from spreading Torah mitzvahs. So it doesn't matter how much you're going to give me a pat on the back and a golden handshake and tell me that I've done Mesiras Nefesh. Didn't mean anything to the Frierdiker Rebbe. He was pained by the fact that right at that moment he could not do his shlichus. Okay, so now we're seeing that the Frierdiker Rebbe is at an incredibly high level, where obviously it's about dedication to the mission, and therefore the pain is not his personal pain, but it's the Eibishter's mission that's not being fulfilled, and that's what causes him pain. So now you're going to ask the question, well, sure, if you're so dedicated to the Eibishter, you should accept that. Using the Frierdiker Rebbe's own words, where he spoke about the tremendous effort that he had invested in spreading Torah and strengthening Judaism. That was nothing. It wasn't because it was a personal issue for him, because he decided that this was a good idea. Nor, but because that's what the Eibishter wants. That's the supernal will. So the Frierdiker Rebbe is not in prison because he did something wrong, chas v'shalom. The only reason he is in prison is because he was absolutely 100% dedicated to the Eibishter Shlichus, and he was doing it to the point of sacrifice. It should be self-understood, as I say, and that's what the Eibishter wants, obviously. The same Frierdiker Rebbe, who's completely dedicated to the mission because that's what the Eibishter wants, surely should acknowledge the fact that if he's in prison at this particular point in time, and even if there's tremendous suffering associated with it, that's what the Eibishter wants. Which takes us right back to our original question. Why would the Frierdiker Rebbe express pain over something that clearly the Eibishter wants? If you're so dedicated to the Eibishter as the Frierdiker Rebbe was, surely it makes no difference. Is the bi'ur bazeh to understand that we have to understand that you can have people fulfilling the same tasks in completely different ways. In the Avodas HaNeshama to durchführen die Shlichus von dem Eibishter and seine Veranzwei, finding there are basically two ways in which a neshama here on earth can fulfill the Eibishter's goals and purpose for creation. And to understand these two paths, let's use an example of the human experience, which is very relatable. There are two ways that a person could engage in business, doing work. You could have a person who's appointed to a particular position. He's employed, he's voluntold, as we say, whatever the case is. He's completely dedicated and he's completely reliable. Could even be that he's not even interested in any reward or any benefits. But the fact is, he's appointed by somebody else. He's representing somebody else. Das nicht sein Sach, nicht sein Geschäft. It's not his business. He might be the CEO, he might be the COO, he might be the managing director. It doesn't matter what title you give him. At the end of the day, it's not necessarily his business. And that would be completely different to when the same work is done by the person who owns the business, because that's something which is personal. It's sein eigenes Geschäft. It's his business, it's his baby. He brought this thing out of the ground. And you know where you'll see this? Where you'll see the difference? After hours. The Unterschied zwischen dem Balabais and dem Angestellten Beimuna, the difference between the person who's the owner of the business and the person who is a trusted employee or appointee, it's not something that will be immediately apparent during the work day, because because they're both completely dedicated and completely on the ball with the work that they have to do. The Chelek, you'll primarily see it afterwards, because between one work day and the next. In dem Zman, after hours, when the Arbeit wird nicht getan und der Esek wird nicht geführt, at the time where the business is closed and we're not actually working, schlaft der Angestellte ruhig. So the person who is hired or appointed has a good night's sleep. He fulfilled all of his requirements, all of his responsibilities. He has no guilt. He can sleep at night. But it's possible that the business is not doing as well as it should, or that they didn't finish a particular quantity of production or whatever it is. The person says, listen, there's not much I could do about it. I don't have a conscience. I did my best. Whereas the owner, if his business is not as it should be, he cannot sleep at night. He cannot relax as long as the objectives of the business are not being fulfilled and realized. So derech says, eine Verein zwei Madrigas in Neshamas und zwei Eifanim in Oisfrent Kavonim from the Meibischen in their Shlichus Balma Hadein. So in the same way, there are two kinds of Neshamas and two approaches of how we go about doing what the Eibishter wants from us in this world. Ein Eifan or Avoide is one approach, as there is in ganzen übergegeben Oisfer in sein Shlichus. Person is completely dedicated, committed to fulfill the shlichus, not because he's interested in himself, not because he needs to say, I achieved, not because this is what the Eibishter wants. And he's therefore so dedicated to what the Eibishter wants that if it's required, he'll even sacrifice his life. But when the person says, I've now done everything that is within my power, and he can't do anything further, he's not going to be in pain because I did my best. I'm completely dedicated to this. If it requires Mesiras Nefesh, I'll do it. But you can jump off the roof, you cannot jump from the ground onto the roof. I can't do something which is beyond me. As we well know, that the halacha is that if a person is in a situation that they cannot control, they are exempt. So he's exempt from doing any further. Especially the person recognizes, I didn't choose this. The way things work out is the Eibish's divine providence. Which means that the Eibishter chose how much ability I'll have, and the Eibishter chose how much of the work will actually get done. Why should I be upset? Why should I eat myself up? This is what the Eibishter wanted. But when a Jew is at a level where they are so deeply one with Hashem, then it's not me fulfilling what the Eibishter wants. It's whatever the Eibishter wants, that is what I want. I don't want anything else except what the Eibishter wants. In that scenario, a person's not just simply going to fulfill their mission they were given. Now, by as the avodah is seiner an eigener inyan, but the person's going to feel this is personal. Not only is it something I care about, this is me. This is what I'm all about. And therefore, when the person has done everything that he is capable of doing, if the fact is that the job isn't complete, so as the, so to speak, owner of this particular interest, he's in pain. Doesn't matter, you could explain whatever you want. The fact is, my objective hasn't been realized. And in this person's experience, the Eibishter's objective is my objective. And there's a powerful story of this from the Rebbe Rasha. In der Zeit von Chakadmur, there was one of these very serious government and rabbinical meetings that happened in Russia in the time of the Rebbe Rashab. Der Asif ist einen gewähren in Zusammenhang damit. The whole purpose and the objective of this particular meeting was, was der Melucha hat dann gefordert, dass die Rabbonen Elandim sollen haben eine gewisse Ausbildung in der Mudachol. They wanted to ensure that anybody who's going to be teaching Torah had to have certain qualifications in secular studies as well. You can imagine all the great Torah leaders were very strongly opposed to the suggestion that Rosh Yeshiva and Melamdim, etc., all now have to get secular accreditation. Die Sarei Amluche haben aber gewarnt, als wir werden nicht nachgeben und annehmen die Gesehre, werden wir nachher schon ein Programm neu finden. But there was a terrible threat from the government that if you don't buy into our new legislation, we're going to launch pogroms chas v'shalom against the Jewish people. So the Rebbe Nishma said, not done by an asif gered zer shav ferreit. And one of the interactions, one of the engagements between the government and the rabbinic leadership, the Rebbe Rashab spoke very harshly. And eventually he was so to speak, drained by the experience that he passed out at the end. So the Scharfkeit von seiner Rede, because he spoke so harshly against the government, and specifically he took aim at the leadership, saying, what is this that you're suggesting there's going to be pogroms? He was very critical and harshly critical of that. They put him into house arrest. Later, when they released him, one of the great rabbinic leaders of the time came in after that to see the Rebbe Rashab and found the Rebbe Rashab was crying. So he said to the Rebbe Rashab, what are you crying for? We did everything in our power. There's nothing further we could have done. So the Rebbe Rashab answered, what's the difference if we did our best? The fact is what we sought to achieve didn't happen. That's the distinction between being a highly committed volunteer, appointee, employee, versus being somebody who lives and breathes the same things that the Eibishter wants. That gives us a tremendous insight into what kind of avodah the Frierdiker Rebbe had. He's not just dedicated to the Eibishter to spread Torah mitzvahs. That fills the Frierdiker Rebbe. That is what he wants. That is his whole reality. And his whole reality is to turn our world into Hashem's home. is b'shas ha'avoda bazeh hat sich abgestellt durch sein Sitzen in Meiser. Now, when he has to sit in prison, and that puts the brakes on, and he can't do his shlichus, and the hemshech avoda is gestanden b'sakon rachmon litzlan, and it's not just a personal thing. The outcome of this particular imprisonment could chas v'shalom have impacted the entire organization. That was tremendously painful. His objective, which is one and the same as Abish's objective, is being stalled. Nochmer uvehaktim, and we could take it even further by reminding ourselves of what we know about Moshe Rabbeinu. We know that the explanation of the pasuk which says that Moshe was the most humble person of all people. That should never suggest that Moshe was unaware of his abilities. Which is why he was chosen to bring the Torah. And he was chosen to take the Eden out of Mitzrayim. He knew that absolutely. He was acutely aware of all of his strengths. Now, Adrabah, so what's the source of his humility? The source of the tremendous humility that Moshe Rabbeinu has is his recognition of his greatness. Because he was acutely aware of the fact that his talents were a gift, and maybe there's the possibility somebody else with the same gift would have achieved even greater than he had achieved, and hence his humility. But the point is, he was absolutely aware of his gifts, his ability, and therefore his responsibilities and his position. Likewise, the Frierdiker Rebbe clearly was absolutely aware of his special abilities. Because you have to know your abilities in order to use them, in order to fulfill the Eibishter Shlichus. Hat euch gewusst, dass der Atzloch in der Avoide gefordert, in der Avoide von Avotzes hat Tervich Yadas, hat gefordert, dass das soll durchgeführt werden darf durch dem Rebben. And the Frierdiker Rebbe is absolutely aware of the fact that if the Avoide of spreading Yiddishkeit is to succeed, it has to be under his leadership. Because no other person at that particular time was empowered as he was empowered to be able to achieve the shlichus. So that would explain just how intensely painful it was for the Frierdiker Rebbe to now be in prison, knowing that the whole goal, the whole operation is on hold. You even find Moshe Rabbeinu had a similar issue or concern. After the Eibishter decreed that Moshe could not take the Yidden into Eretz Yisrael, that bothered Moshe Rabbeinu so much that he davened, ois beten beim Eibishter, as er können reinbringen die Yidden in Eretz Yisrael, begging the Eibishter that he should take the Yidden into Eretz Yisrael. Bis as meruftes on a Talmud kamas sarvan. To the extent that we even use negative expressions. Look how almost stubborn, how much he refuses to accept Eibishter's word. Was is moving? As I kavona dabei is nie given to live sein eigener te'eles. Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't arguing for himself because he was interested, because he needed to be in Eretz Yisrael. No, seine Savar reinzukommen in Eretz Yisrael is given. His personal desire to enter Eretz Yisrael was via bein eved neman, exactly in the same way as you'd expect from a very dedicated, reliable servant. So mamale seine mashlam sein der Odin Eibishter's shlichus, that way he could fulfill the Eibishter shlichus. Was is given to Vasim Shel Yisrael, which is for the benefit of the Yidden. How would he, entering Eretz Yisrael, do such an incredibly different job for the Yidden than what Yeshua did? Because Moshe Rabbeinu had gewusst, Moshe knew, as das was lachaz mein wird sein der Churban Abai, is the fact that subsequently, in many centuries later, the Beis Hamikdash would be destroyed, and even wieder davon getting Golus v'chulei, which would result in the Jews returning into a state of Golus, which he, of course, fought to take the Yidden out of. Wird sein verbunden damit, was Yeshua wird reinbringen in Eretz Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu understood that the only reason there'd be the possibility of a Churban and a Golus is if Yeshua took them into Eretz Yisrael. Whereas if he took them into Eretz Yisrael, that would never happen. Mashiach would come immediately. On that far after, that's why he davened so persistently to be able to get into Eretz Yisrael. Weil wenn Moshe wollte gewähnt der Machnis von Yidden in Eretz Yisrael, because Moshe knew if he's the one taking the Yidden into Eretz Yisrael, then wollten sie Gehatakim Nitzchi Ba'aretz, they would have been in Eretz Yisrael permanently. The Beis Hamikdash wollte nicht Charev geworden. The Beis Hamikdash would never been destroyed. On us wollte man nicht gewinnen Kenshiv and Malchus, and there'd be no suffering under any of the nations of the world. So now we understand why, for the Frierdiker Rebbe, it's a painful experience, because the Eibishter's will is his will, and so therefore the blockage of the Eibishter's will is his pain. So when the Chaltz nicht moving, still one other thing we have to clarify. But surely the Friedrich Rebbe also acknowledged that every single thing is Hashgacha Pratis. Und der Tag ist Kavona von der Eibishten, als durch Avotz hat Torah v'chizuk hayadus und Nisgale werden Elikus be'elam, bis as Welt soll werden Adil Yisborach wird gewiss ausgeführt werden. Plus, you have to know that the Eibish's intention, which is that the Torah should be spread, that Judaism should be strengthened, that the world should become Hashem's home, it's going to happen. It's guaranteed. Surely that then indicates that the Friedrich Rebbe being in prison is obviously not to weaken the avodah of the Friedrich Rebbe. Now, verkehrt, but the exact opposite, as is often the case. This will actually cause a strengthening of the mission to spread Judaism around the world, which is in fact what happened. Als noch der Gimmel von Rebbe ist noch mehr verstärkt geworden die Arbeit von Chizuk HaYadus. When the Friedrich Rebbe emerged from the prison, the work to spread and strengthen Judaism increased, possibly even exponentially. Bis das hat geführt zu der Erziehung von Rebbe in Medina Hahi. In fact, one of the direct outcomes of the Friedrich Rebbe's release was that he was able to leave that part of the world. Was das hat ermöglicht, als seine Arbeit in der Fotze HaTorah bei Chizuk HaYadus ist gewesen viel mehr verstärkt und verbreitet. And that, allowing the Friedrich Rebbe access to move to the free world, obviously lifted the whole avodah to a completely different degree. To an extent that you could touch the whole world. And that's similar to when the Jews came into Eretz Yisrael. Yes, from our perspective, it seems like it was second best, because instead of Moshe, it was Yeshua took the Jews in. Und der Fall hat gekannt sein und gewende Churban v'Golos, which is the reason why it was possible, and in fact it was a Churban and a Golos. Is das aber safe gewende Tevasim Shal Yisrael, but we now have the benefit of hindsight to recognize that that is something that was in our interest, for our benefit. Das hat aufgetan, als alle Giluyim soll nimshach werden durch die Avodah von Eden, because what it achieved was, instead of all the great input from the Eibush into this world being a gift, it's something we earn. Yes, of course we earn it through a long time and a lot of very difficult work and having to deal with very harsh circumstances, but at the end of the day we earn all of the Gilui Likus in this world. Which incidentally also means that by the time the Eibush is revealed in the time of Moshiach, it will be a far, far superior revelation. So we benefit from the difficulty. So why would the Friedrich Rebbe feel pain and suffering from knowing that this whole experience in the prison is ultimately for the best interests of the Jewish people? The explanation is this. The reality is that as long as the Friedrich Rebbe was in prison, there was a blockage and concealment of the avodah of spreading Torah mitzvahs through the world. During the time the Friedrich Rebbe is in prison, the operation of spreading Yiddishkeit is less than it was before he went into prison. That is painful. And it's not only painful with regards to the neshama living in a world and, so to speak, being blocked from doing its mission, but it's also painful for the Eibusha, so to speak, because the fact that the Eibusha cannot be revealed in the world in the proper manner during this period is quote-unquote painful for the Eibusha. A great way to illustrate this would be what Hasidus teaches us about Tzimtzum, the filtration process that the Eibusha uses to remove the vast majority of his reality from us so that we could exist. The Friedrich Rebbe speaks about this in a Maimer around Yud Beis Tammuz. We all know that the Eibusha didn't hide himself in order to be hidden, but in order that there should be greater Giloi that follows. In fact, the only reason there is a Tzimtzum is to reveal. It's like the teacher. The only reason the teacher doesn't give us all of the information at once is so we can actually understand the information that's being taught. The Tzimtzum is for the purpose of Giloi, that we should have something that we could relate to. But the actual experience and process of Tzimtzum is antithetical to what the Eibush is all about. Because the ultimate purpose of the Eibush is revelation. So therefore, a temporary blockage of that revelation, not a good thing. Now that we know this, and we understand that the prison experience is in its own sake negative, and to the extent that the Frierdiker Rebbe feels pain from it, now we understand what mitigates that pain is the Frierdiker Rebbe's thoughts about the Baal Shem Tov's teachings about Hashgacha Pratis. Firstly, that the Hashgacha Pratis extends even to non-human elements of the world. And the specifics of each species and the specifics of each thing going on in each creature's life. So how that helped the Frierdiker Rebbe to endure the difficulties and to eventually leave prison. Is what the Frierdiker Rebbe wants to tell us. It's not emphasizing so much that Hashgacha Pratis also affects non-human parts of the world. Now the Chiddush was kommt heraus mishitas Baal Shem Tov. Rather, what the Frierdiker Rebbe wanted to emphasize is something incredibly unique that the Baal Shem Tov revolutionizes, as it says, that the extent and the degree of the Hashgacha Pratis for non-human elements, is something that is different to how people anticipate, and therefore relevant to our Hashgacha Pratis as well. The Rebbe is mevoyer in Ayud Beis Tammuz dika maimer as din von Hashgacha Pratis was the Baal Shem Tov is mevoyer. So the Frierdiker Rebbe explains in Ayud Beis Tammuz maimer that the doctrine of Hashgacha Pratis that the Baal Shem Tov teaches may nicht nur as jede tnua Pratis von jedem nivra is Hashgacha Pratis von Beir Yisbarach. It's not just simply that every single movement of every single thing that exists is choreographed by the Eibishter. Nochmer as die tnua Pratis von dem nivra Prati, but the specific movement of the specific entity in the specific moment, speaks to the entire overarching mission and purpose of the whole of creation. Meaning, the movement of one blade of grass is that helps to fulfill and complete the Eibish's purpose for the whole creation. It's a little blade of grass and impacts the whole creation, including the spiritual realms. And that adds value and perspective into us understanding the Eibish's guidance and providence for us, which is directly relevant to the Frierdiker Rebbe's comments. So let's talk for a moment about those schools of thought who say that there's only divine providence for humans, whereas all other life forms, the Eibishter gives like a general oversight. Hashgacha minis lo ishis, as the Rambam says, that the Eibishter looks after the species, not the individual creature. So everybody agrees that if there is a lesser divine providence for non-human entities, it's only with regards to their personal experiences and things. But the moment something that is to do with an animal or a plant or a mineral crosses over into affecting the life of a human, then all of the other philosophers agree that there must be Hashgacha Pratis over that particular element of that particular entity's life because it affects us. Now, the language over here is really important because according to their view, again, let's use the Rambam over here, the Eibush is not going to make a decree that those fish should live or die. Rather, the Eibush made a decree that this human should be able to get that fish to eat and to survive or to sell. And likewise, there is Hashgacha Pratis around things that are owned by humans. So there's Hashgacha Pratis about your ox, your car, your jug, because it intersects with the human, so therefore it's impossible. So in other words, if an animal dies in a forest and there's nobody around to see it, according to the Rambam and others, it's not Hashgacha Pratis. The minute there's a human involved, it's upgraded to have Hashgacha Pratis. If you go with that thinking, as even from Hashgacha Pratis is Dafka al ha'adam, then the entire principle of divine providence is a human experience. And the reason is, because the human is the purpose of creation, and specifically, the Jewish people specifically. So if this is the goal and purpose of the whole of creation, you can expect that the Eibush is laser focused on that area of life to make sure that it's cared for. Even if what the person is engaged with at that particular time is a lower life form that doesn't really deserve Hashgacha Pratis. That helps us understand that the different opinions about how Hashgacha Pratis works will also relate to how the different opinions understand the Hashgacha Pratis of humans. In the Inyanim was mezet in Zaymaila so Adam, mitzad welcher is tachlis abriya, is the Hashgacha Pratis of them beifan gole. So, when you're dealing with a human being and things that have to do with a human as a human, who is the purpose of creation, then you're going to see Kriya Hashgacha Pratis. Ma shein ken azach, was is by modern below in tofel. But if there's any part of the human's experience, which is a secondary part of his experience, then was said nicht in Irmaila Sodom. You don't see that this is a uniquely human experience. You don't see the greatness of the human in this particular area. Then the Eibush is not going to direct personal providence for that item, but only personal providence to the person, and depending how important that item is in the person's life will determine how much providence. That's according to the other opinions. Whereas the opinion of the Baal Shem Tov, which is relevant and core to our conversation, is totally different. As he had a prat to prat from the Bria, every single detail of existence. Even the waving of a little blade of grass in the wind. Is not an independent minor event. It is something that affects the whole of creation, the whole purpose of creation. It is mashlim makavono ho'elyona binyan abriya. It brings the Eibishter's purpose for creation to fruition. So if that's true about the blade of grass, it's a million times the case true for something in a human's life. Not only is everything in my life directed by Hashem, not only is everything in my life that the Eibusher doesn't do anything negative, chas v'shalom. Everything in my life is bringing to a head the Eibusher's goal for creation. Which explains what the Friedrich Rebbe was telling us by saying those Maimorim, which also spoke about Hashgacha Pratis, and the Baal Shem Tov Shita helped through the prison. The Uftu von Shittas Baal Shem Tov in Hashgacha Pratis hat gebracht dem der Herr, this awareness of the Baal Shem Tov's unique doctrine about Hashgacha Pratis sensitized the Friedrich Rebbe as a Baal Demais v'Yisura of Zani Hashgacha Pratis. The fact that he's in prison, the fact that he is suffering, that's obviously Hashgacha Pratis. Is nice if dem was der Fuhn wird herauskommen der Schlomo von der Kavone Höljene durch der Safa bechizuk in Afatzes Hayadus. So first of all, obviously, good will come out of it, and the Jews will be stronger because of it, and Chassidus will blossom because of it. And that's going to happen nach the Geula for the Meise Canal, after the imprisonment is over. But it's more than that. It's echt der Etzem Meise v'Yisurav Chulei, even the details, step by step, of the prison, and all of the suffering, is mashlim akavono ho'elyona binyan abriya tzemagalazani lukus b'olam. That completes the goal and purpose of creation, which is to radiate godliness into the world. Now this greatness, you could see, was the Etzem Meiser gebracht b'shas Meiser noch mehr serious and Mrs. Nefesh zwischen ihnen bechlal und Chassidov and Mekushara befrat. You see this happening in real time. Because while the Friedrich Rebbe is in prison, it elicits from the Jewish community, and certainly from the Chassidim, greater dedication to Torah. They all came to the party to strengthen the Friedrich Rebbe's efforts to strengthen Judaism. And noch mehr. In fact, not only was there this strengthening of the Jewish community outside of the prison walls, but there was a strengthening in the prison too. Because the Etzem Stel von Rebbe mit der Tekef Otzim in seiner Anhoge dort, the strength and assertiveness with which the Friedrich Rebbe behaved while in prison, as soll fadi even umenagdim zu kedusha kal nit ni spoil veren, as the Friedrich Rebbe writes in his own diary of the imprisonment, that he took a strong resolution not to in any way be impacted, affected, or upset or react to the behavior of the interrogators. Noch mehr, also bechlal nit halten falsch kemetzias. Not only is he not going to react, he's not going to consider them at all. Bis hat sich geguckt, wie sie wollten sein, kein etwas mamisch. He took a view that it was as if they didn't exist. It wasn't just a theoretical position. That's how he behaved. They told him to stand. He didn't stand, etc. That means that the Friedrich Rebbe is able to publicize in the prison that there's nothing but the Eibishter. And it had an impact on them. It caused them to have a degree of bittul. What does bittul mean? that they had to give up their original malevolent intentions, and they had to be the ones who would free the Frierdiker Rebbe. Vigret Meramal Baruch, as the Rebbe has discussed multiple times, that's the greatness, the so to speak, turning of the communist regime itself, rather than the conquering of the regime. We know that every time we come to the anniversary of these occasions and we recall the events, they reoccur. And the whole body follows the head, which is the Nasi. So therefore, the behavior of the Frierdiker Rebbe and what the Frierdiker Rebbe shared with us is a lesson, and it empowers us how we should behave. The first thing is to acknowledge no force in the world should interfere with us doing the Rebbe's shlichus. Strengthen Yiddishkeit, spread Torah. Aber das ist möglich, als dem, was die Arbeit führt, nicht durch Bezirzas Hadrusha. It's very possible that the fact that things are not working as well or as quickly as they should, that could delay Mashiach. So we need to be acutely aware of this. We can't just say, oh, there's difficulties, there's challenges. On the other hand, simultaneously, we also have to realize, as in welchem Maim in the Matzav Eid soll sich gefinden, no matter our circumstances, even when a person feels that they hit a brick wall and there's nothing that they can do to contribute to the mission of spreading Yiddishkeit and Torah and Chassidus, it shouldn't get us down. We certainly shouldn't despair. We have to recognize that even the challenges we're going through are Ashkocha Pratis. That when we invest the correct kind of effort, we'll see tremendous success beyond our imagination. That we can actually reveal godliness even in a place that is ungodly. And when we're able to reveal Elikus in the most difficult, dark circumstances, that would be the direct cause of revealing the Eibusha properly in the world, which will hasten the coming of Mashiach, when the Eibusha will be completely revealed, and the whole world will see with their physical eyes that's the Eibusha speaking. And obviously in that time of Gilui, there'll be no more darkness, no more obstacles. It should happen. Take it from Yad Mamash.